Firstly, tonight we'll be using the webinar side of Zoom, so we will not be able to hear you and you won't be able to ask questions verbally. So if you've got questions, please put them in the Q&A section. We will try and follow the chat, but that can get a bit messy depending on how many people engage in what chat. So if you really got a question, please put it in the Q&A. We're pleased to have Sabina Assan and Margaret Jewell tonight, and we'll introduce them in a little while. But before we do that, I'd like to take the opportunity to pay our respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we're broadcasting from tonight. In my case, it's Southern New South Wales and Wiradjuri land. And we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging elders for land that was never ceded. Now we'll probably, how are we going for people that have come in? Oh, we're getting there, so I think we'll keep going. Firstly, I'll introduce Sabina Assan. Sabina joined EMBA in 2022 as a coal mining methane analyst, raising the profile of coal mine methane and promoting the technologies and policies to measure and reduce these emissions. She has over 5 years' experience in the environmental sector, including work in measuring fugitive emissions from anthropogenic sites in Europe. She holds a PhD in environmental science from, and I hope I get this right, Laboratoires des Sciences du Climat et de Environnement, whatever, I guess some department. She might say it better, and holds a Master of Science in Physics. Sabina recently led a report on the impact of fugitive emissions from coal mines on Australia's climate targets. So I'll hand over to Sabina to give her a short talk.
Thanks, Peter. We can just say LSE, it's easier. We don't have to say it all out in French. Thank you very much for having me here today. As Peter mentioned, I'm going to talk about coal mine methane emissions. As for the past year, we've been working along with a lot of other grassroots NGOs in Australia, looking at the methane emissions from coal mines, how big they are and how can we mitigate and reduce these emissions. I'm just going to figure out how to share my screen.
Looks like it's starting. No. Your slides, but you're still in sort of screen mode.
Okay. Is that working?
No, you're still in the screen. You haven't actually got into the actual slideshow, I don't think. That looks better. That's it. Yes. Very good.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So I can't see you anymore, Peter. So if no. You need me to stop or anything, just shout at me and I'll stop. All right, let's get into it. So climate change, I think, unfortunately, we've all started to feel the effects of climate change, more or less, depending on where you're living. But we're now seeing unprecedented warming. And just as a reminder, so today, global temperature has risen by around 1 degree Celsius since 1880. And we're also seeing accelerated sea level rise, which is 10 centimeters since 1993. The latest figures from the International Panel of Climate Change. And generally, when we talk about climate change and global warming, this is due to greenhouse gases, and the two main culprits are carbon dioxide and methane. So just to have a quick background check on methane, Carbon dioxide and both methane have been increasing at record rates, particularly methane for the past 2 years. We're seeing greater increases than ever before. And there's actually around 200 times more CO2 in the atmosphere than methane. However, methane is responsible for around 1/3 of the observed heating, whereas CO2 is responsible for about half of it. So when we talk about methane, you know, why is so, I guess, little of a gas so impactful in heating the environment? And that's because of generally its molecular structure and atmospheric physics. So when methane is emitted, immediately after it's emitted, it can trap almost 100 times more heat than, you know, 1 molecule of carbon dioxide. So it's a much more potent greenhouse gas in terms of trapping heat. I guess we could call it the silver lining of methane, is that it actually has a relatively short lifetime compared to carbon dioxide. So methane will live for around 12 years in the atmosphere before it then reacts and it becomes CO2 and water generally, whereas carbon dioxide will stay for hundreds of years in the atmosphere. So this is what this plot by the research from Kleinberg shows quite nicely, is when a methane pulse is emitted, it's the line in red, you'll see it increases super quickly. So it will heat super quickly, but already over 20 to 40 years, the heating from methane is not as impactful anymore. Whereas an emission 100 times that of carbon dioxide will have a similar initial increase in terms of heating, but it's going to carry on living in the atmosphere for hundreds of years. And so the fact that methane breaks down so fast in the atmosphere is why methane is now seen as probably the most efficient or fastest way to slow down global warming in the short term. Because if we can start reducing our methane emissions now, we're going to see this effect within 20 and 40 years, and this is going to give the community more time to start tackling these longer living greenhouse gases, such as carbon dioxide and some others. And this is where the methane pledge comes into play. So according to the IPCC, we have to cut methane emissions by at least 30% by 2030 if we want to keep within the 1.5 temperature limit. And methane mitigation is seen as a standout option for achieving this near and long-term climate and air quality benefits. So far, there's around 130 participants to the pledge, Australia being one of the most recent countries to sign up. And I guess an important thing to highlight is that the methane pledge is a commitment from countries to reduce global methane emissions by 30%. So it's also a commitment for this country to improve their measuring and their reporting of methane emissions, and to show that they are doing, you know, concrete actions to try and tackle their methane emissions. So what are Australia's sources of methane? In 2021, Australia emitted around 4.4 million tonnes of methane, and 23% of these emissions were from coal mines. So that's around 1 million tonnes of methane were emitted. And you'll see that this means that coal mining is the second largest source of Australia's methane emissions. Agricultural methane is the largest source, so it's the largest sector, and it makes up for 48%. And within that, the vast majority is from enteric fermentation, which is from cattle. We then have a significant amount of emissions also from waste, which will be landfill and wastewater sites. There's some from oil and gas, and then there's a few other smaller sources that would then make up the 100%. So what is coal mine methane, or why does coal mining even emit methane? So methane is inherent in coal seams. Depending how much methane depends on geological conditions. But overall, whenever we're going to mine coal, there is going to be some methane released. As a rule of thumb, the deeper you go when you mine the coal, the more methane intense that coal is going to be. So even though there's many more open cut mines in Australia, they only make up around 33% of the coal mine methane emissions. On the other hand, there's fewer underground mines, but because they're so much deeper, they're emitting a lot more methane, and they actually represent around 67% of methane emissions of coal mine methane emissions. Open cut mines will start releasing methane once the operations actually begin to mine. So once they start excavating and fracturing and taking the coal, the methane is just going to be emitted into the atmosphere while they mine. With underground mines, it's slightly more complicated, as there's a few different processes. So if an underground mine is particularly gassy, they might need to pre-drain the methane. So that means remove some of the methane before the mining even begins. And this can be methane emissions. Then whilst they're mining, because the mine, in underground mines, you need to keep the methane concentrations below a certain level. Otherwise, there's a risk of explosions. And so obviously it's a safety risk and operational risk. So they need to be making sure that there's not too much methane in the underground mine. And so what they do is they sort of flush loads of fresh air through the vents of the mine. And this is just to flush out all the methane that could be accumulating in the vents. And so although this has a very low concentration of methane, because there's such a large volume of air going through, this type of methane emission makes up the majority of an underground mine's emissions. And lastly, for underground mines, another important factor is even once the mining has stopped, so even once operations have ceased, if mines are not flooded or sealed properly, which is often the case, they can just carry on emitting methane emissions for years. So for sure, 20 years, 50 years in Europe, we've seen even up to 100 years after the mining has stopped. So this can also be a very significant source of methane emissions. Right, so there's all this methane. What can we do to stop it? The good news is that there are readily available proven technologies. They've been around for a number of years that we can use to reduce coal mine methane emissions. So when we talk about reducing coal mine methane emissions, the discussion is not, is it technically feasible to reduce emissions? The discussion is really, is it economically feasible to reduce these emissions? Because around 1/3 to 50% of coal mine methane emissions generally can be mitigated or reduced at a low or even negative cost. So negative means that for example, the mine could actually make money or use the methane that it captures. The other 50% of it can start coming at increasingly high costs. And then there's a question of, is it economically viable for a mine to mitigate that methane? One of the most recent studies from the Climate and Clean Air Coalition found that to mitigate 1/3 of coal mine methane is 4 times cheaper than to mitigate the 1/3 of agricultural emissions. So methane emissions, there is from coal mines, there is a large chunk of it which is very easy to reduce, and that mines can be doing and should be doing without too much effort, I guess, if we're talking about methane mitigation and what other sectors would have to do to mitigate their methane. I think I'm not going to go into too much detail about all the different types of reduction techniques. In our most recent report, we have an infographic where you can click and you can kind of see interactively some information about the different types of techniques. I will just say that for underground mines and open cut mines is slightly different, but generally it's about, for example, removing more gas before you start mining, or streamlining operations better. So you're reducing leaks and such. So our most recent work was looking at, okay, so we know how much methane is being reported from coal mines in Australia. We know that it's possible to mitigate a significant amount of it. What would this mean for Australia? So how much of their coal mine methane could they produce? And what we found was that there is the potential to reduce coal mine methane emissions by a hefty 77%. And this would really come from a combination of phasing out thermal coal and mitigating emissions from coal mines that will carry on functioning past 2030. So I guess it's important to highlight that there's two uses of coal. The first is thermal coal, which is the coal used in electricity generation. It's obviously also comes with a whole lot of CO2 emissions, and in generally most net zero trajectories, the globe needs to start phasing out thermal coal. So by 2030, and that's what we've also assumed here, is that Australia could phase out its thermal coal, and this would remove around 40% of their coal mine methane emissions by 2030. The rest of the coal, which is generally metallurgical coal, this is coal used for steel making, and it's seen as it's going to be very important even past 2030. If we implement as much mitigation as possible on these mines and on the thermal coal mines until they phase out, we could see a reduction of almost 37% of coal mine methane emissions. And together, this would look like almost 18% of Australia's total methane emissions. So if we're thinking about the methane pledge and a 30% target, here coal mine methane reductions really could take the brunt, I guess, of these emissions reductions. I think a last important point to highlight here is that we also looked at the list of proposed new coal mines and coal mine expansions from the government. And what we found was that if these go ahead, rather than reductions, would actually increase emissions by around 50%. So new coal mines and new coal mines expansions are really in opposition to any types of methane or methane reduction targets that the government would be looking into. So my last slide is tackling, I guess, an important issue of the importance of correctly measuring emissions. So even though Australia probably has one of the best measuring and reporting frameworks for the major coal producing countries, there is still a risk that they're significantly underestimating their emissions. So a recent estimate from the International Energy Agency found that, or estimated that Australia's emissions are around, methane emissions from coal mines could be around 800,000 tonnes more than they're currently reporting. And these estimates are coming from a combination of factors and also using new satellite data, which has been starting to see higher emissions than what is being reported on the ground. I'll just give you one, I would say, most famous example of this is the Hale Creek open cut mine in Queensland. Was found by researchers in the Netherlands using satellite data to be emitting 10 times that what they are reporting on the ground. And this is for 4 years in a row. So this is where we could start understanding that maybe there's a discrepancy between what's actually being emitted or what satellites are seeing and what mines are reporting on the ground. And one of the reasons for this is because there are some holes and improvements to be made in how mines are currently measuring or estimating their methane emissions. And again, if there's any questions about this, we can go into more detail of it afterwards. But one example is that open cut mines do not need to actually measure their emissions. So when they report their emissions, it's an estimate. I would call it a guesstimate, as what they use is they use their coal production, how much coal they've produced, and they can multiply this by a default emission factor for the amount of methane in coal for the entire state. And there's been much research to show that methane emissions, one default emission factor for emissions in an entire state are not representative, as the methane can change from mine to mine within a state and within a coal basin. It can vary significantly. So by estimating the methane emissions like this, we're really not seeing any granularity, and we would miss any certain maybe very methane intensive mines if we're just estimating like this without actually making measurements. So a key step if we want to start implementing methane mitigation measures is to really understand how much mines are emitting, which ones are super emitting mines, and what mitigation we could use for each mine.
Good.
Yes. So I have just my key takeaways. I don't know if we have time for
Okay,
that.
you've still got time. Keep going.
Okay. So 4 key takeaways. The first is methane and the pledge. Methane is potent, but it's short-lived. The most effective opportunity to reduce warming in the short term, and emissions need to be cut by at least 30% by 2030 if we want to keep to the 1.5 temperature limit. Secondly, coal mines are major methane emitters. They're responsible for 23% of Australia's annual methane emissions, but it could be even more. Thirdly, we need to measure and mitigate. Emissions reductions start by improving current measuring, reporting, and verification. And there are a number of currently available technologies that we can use to reduce methane now, but reducing coal use is also going to be very important if we want to get these methane emissions down. And lastly, that coal mines really could do the heavy lifting of pledge targets. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabina. Well, we won't waste too much time, but we'll move straight on to Margaret. But when we finish Margaret's talk, I'll take a few minutes to explain what FCA's role in all of this is, whilst you're thinking about whatever questions you might want to ask. So tonight we're joined by Margaret Jewell. Margaret is the MLA's Carbon Neutral 2030 CN30 Manager. She is an agricultural scientist with a PhD in plant genetics and 10+ years experience in intensive and extensive agriculture. Margaret is committed to ensuring that Australian agriculture can prosper while remaining sustainable and contributing to Australia's greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets. I think we'll now hand over to Margaret to give a small talk on MLA's methane emissions activities. Margaret.
Thanks, Peter. I'll just share my screen as well. Hopefully everybody can see that now. So I'll just tonight give an overview of what the Australian red meat industry have been working on for the last few years since we announced our target to be carbon neutral by 2030. So firstly, the Australian red meat industry has an overarching strategic plan, and the vision outlined in that plan is to double the value of Australian red meat sales as the trusted source of the highest quality protein. And MLA, who are the research, development and adoption service provider to the red meat industry, also have a vision for our organisation to foster the long-term prosperity of Australian red meat producers. But achieving carbon neutrality was called out as a key success indicator of the red meat industry strategic plan. And this is really just a great indication of how we're approaching achieving our CN30 target, because what we're focused on first and foremost is really the prosperity of the red meat industry. And we are focusing on developing technologies that can improve the efficiency of the production of red meat and at the same time improve productivity, while having a focus on doing that in the most sustainable way possible. So CN30 is a target for the red meat industry to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, and it's a coordinated research, development and adoption effort. Our role at MLA is to invest producer levies and partner funds into development of technologies that producers can implement, and also in supporting producers to adopt those technologies. The way that we measure progress to CN30 is it's outlined in our annual emissions updates that the CSIRO do for us every year, and they take data that's compiled by the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory and allocate emissions to the red meat industry based on where red meat is produced in the landscape. And a really a common misconception and an important thing to understand is that it's an industry-wide target. So it doesn't require that all red meat producers achieve a carbon neutral position, but rather it recognises the fact that we are custodians of a huge area of Australia's landscape. And because of that, we've got an opportunity to store a lot of carbon in the landscape to offset the emissions from the industry that we're unable to eliminate. So we've been working on this. The CN30 target was announced in 2017, and it was off the back of some work that the CSIRO and some other organisations partnered with us that found that achieving CN30 was possible. We compared our emissions in 2015 with our baseline year, which is 2005, in line with the Paris Agreement. And every year we do an emissions update. So the process that the CSIRO uses is very transparent, and it's published every year. And since 2005, we're now able to say that we've reduced net emissions from the industry by almost 60%. But that's vastly due to changes in land management, which means that it's not really reductions in methane, but it's being able to offset our emissions with reduced emissions and increased stored carbon from basically reduced clearing and increased regrowth of vegetation. And so since 2017, we've invested over $140 million in research that's specifically aimed at addressing the target. So our target is really ambitious. I've been overseas in October, and it's certainly recognised as one of the most ambitious targets in the world, but it's also achievable. So as I said, we're custodians of a large area of Australia. It's about half of the landmass, 355 million hectares, and less than 8% of that land is suitable for anything other than ruminant production. Because we operate over such a large area, we're in a really unique position compared with a lot of other countries, because we can do practices or incorporate practices that result in increased carbon storage. We've also got a lot fewer animals that are in intensive systems at any one time. So whereas in a lot of European countries, they also have to focus on emissions of nitrogen and carbon dioxide a lot more. We really are focused on the methane problem in Australia because most of our livestock are produced in extensive systems. So when we're talking to producers about how they can be involved in CN30 and start thinking about how they can reduce their emissions, we really try and explain to them that this concept of carbon use efficiency. And in agriculture, we often hear about nitrogen use efficiency and water use efficiency, but carbon use efficiency isn't really a commonly used term, which is probably a bit interesting because carbon makes up the majority of actually what people are producing when they're producing livestock. So essentially, if we can maximize the amount of carbon that's being sequestered through photosynthesis and then being stored in our soils and converted into either vegetation or live weight gain in livestock, rather than being lost as a byproduct, which is mostly methane in our industry, it's retaining carbon within our production systems. And essentially that results in lots of other co-benefits in addition to retaining carbon, such as improved biodiversity and just general health of a production system. It's good for production. So it's essentially got benefits for the bottom line for producers that go beyond just focusing on carbon. So we're really coming at this with a best practice approach that is aimed to have really healthy agricultural production systems, but at the same time be reducing our methane emissions. And so when we think about methane and the fact that it's a byproduct, it really makes a huge amount of sense for our industry to be focusing on it. At the end of the day, about 10% of feed energy that comes from pastures or grain is lost as methane. And it's equivalent in cows to about 33 to 60 grazing days per year, or in sheep, 30 to 31 grazing days per year. So there's obviously some substantial production advantages if we can redirect that methane that's being lost as a byproduct instead into a live weight gain. And that's why we've got such a big focus on this in our industry at the moment, because we've got advantages that span continued community and consumer support and market access and access to capital, but also has those potential huge productivity advantages as well. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this slide, but it's my second last slide, so I'm not going to talk forever. We've got a CN30 roadmap that you can have a look at online that goes into a lot of detail about what we're doing and what the roles and responsibilities are of all of the other stakeholders in the industry and the other research organisations and state and federal government departments that we're working with. But it also outlines these 4 work areas that provide our framework at MLA for how we're investing in different types of activities in pursuit of the target. So firstly, we've got our industry leadership work area, and this is really the adoption piece. So the main focus for us is on technology development, which I'll talk about in the greenhouse gas emissions avoidance and carbon storage work areas. But we can develop all the technology we want. If we can't support producers to adopt those technologies, it's not going to make much difference. So we're working really, really hard at raising awareness of red meat producers about carbon and about what opportunities are out there for them, especially now that carbon has been monetized, to start considering carbon as just another component of their business planning activities. We've recently released our Carbon 101 e-learning module, and this is the first of a series of 4 carbon modules. It really just goes through, what carbon is and is a kind of provides a basic understanding of carbon in livestock production systems. And there'll be 3 more modules which go into how to do a carbon account and what types of practices producers can implement on farm to reduce their net emissions and emissions intensity. We're also developing a longer training package called Carbon Edge, which we'll be piloting towards the end of next year. In the greenhouse gas emissions avoidance work area, which I guess is the one that most people on the call today are interested in, this is where we're really focusing on how we can reduce the amount of methane that our industry produces. We're working across grazing properties, feedlots and processing facilities. And there are lots of activities that producers can do right now. And in Australia, most producers are already doing a lot of these practices because they're generally just best practice. So I guess by improving feed-based quality and including legumes, there can be direct and indirect impacts on reducing methane. They can be direct if there's plant secondary compounds included in the pastures like tannins, lipids and saponins, and they can inhibit the production of enteric methane. But in addition to that, if we just provide a really high quality diets to our animals, then it increases their weight gain rates and means essentially that they're out in paddocks producing methane for a shorter period of time before they go for sale. We're also working hard on genetics. So we've got some big programs in genetics that are looking at developing EBVs, so estimated breeding values, and also Australian sheep breeding values for traits that are specifically related to methane. And then we'll look to be including those in the currently available genetic selection indices. But as well as that, there's lots of traits that producers can select for now that result in reducing emissions. And they're things like improved fertility, improved feed conversion efficiency, and things like that. I guess what we're all probably most interested in is the supplements work area. There are supplements that are out there now. Things like phosphorus can actually improve fertility and improve live weight gain and animal health. And so they can also work to reduce methane emissions. But we've also got this big focus on some really potent feed additives, such as the red asparagopsis seaweed, and there's another product called Bovir that we're looking at. We've also got some relatively new leads in the supplements area that we are investigating, and they've been shown to be able to reduce methane emissions by up to 90%. And I guess the silver bullet, and there's not going to be a silver bullet, there will be a range of activities that contribute, would be an additive that can reduce emissions, but also have that role in redirecting the methane that's being lost instead into live weight gain. And so that's a huge focus for us. Obviously, it's very easy to get these type of additives into feedlot rations, and that's where we've been doing most of the research, just because feedlots are a very good they're sort of like a living lab for us to practice with these things. But we've also got a lot of work going into potential delivery mechanisms for grazing systems. And again, there's not going to be a one size fits all for this. It's going to depend on where you are and what you're producing. But we're looking at delivery through reticulated water supply, delivery through loose licks and lick blocks, and also delivery through boluses, which are essentially ingestibles that slowly biodegrade completely over time, and as they do so, they release a sustained dose of additive directly into the rumen. In the carbon storage work area, the main focus is on reducing the costs associated with soil carbon measurement. So that can be really prohibitive to producers to understand what their baseline soil carbon levels are. And we're also looking at improving the data in Australia that underpins whether or not certain practices can result in improved soil carbon. And we're also developing some tools and resources to allow producers to incorporate trees into their livestock production systems in ways that they don't only have a carbon benefit. So we don't want people to be looking up land to grow trees anymore. We rather see producers planting shelter belts and planting trees in a way that they have benefits for livestock production through providing shade and shelter. And obviously that also has a lot of other co-benefits such as improved biodiversity, water holding capacity, soil health, and just overall system health. And then the last work area is our integrated management systems work area. There's kind of two facets to this that we're working on. So we're working a lot with the federal government on developing the required methodologies to enable producers to account for the emissions reductions they can achieve from things like additives and legumes that some are available now, but some, as I said, will be coming in the future, so that producers can be remunerated or benefited for using those. And we're also working on frameworks to enable producers to access markets around like premium low carbon and carbon neutral products. And those markets are emerging now. We've got 4 carbon neutral red meat products in Australia at the moment. All of those have been developed by calculating baseline emissions and then purchasing offsets to balance those out. And that's a perfectly acceptable way to be an early mover and get involved in the carbon neutral branded space now. But in all cases, there are plans to integrate technologies into systems and reduce the reliance on purchased offsets over time. And that's the direction that we want to go in the red meat industry as well. As certainly no interest in us getting to 2029 and then purchasing offsets to get over the line for CN30. And yeah, I think I covered that for integrated management systems. So just some key messages, and I probably didn't touch on this too much in the talk, but if you're a producer now wondering how to get involved, the absolute first thing you should do is start to collate the data that you need to do a carbon account, and so that you can understand what your net emissions position is now and start to understand what practices you might like to think about to make improvements in your net emissions position. But of course, we also want producers to think about practices that make sense for them. So we don't want people to go out and plant trees if they've got the type of land that isn't going to support that, but we want them to be introducing practices that are also going to have benefits to their bottom line. And then the next step is to explore available opportunities. So again, I haven't really talked too much about that, but this isn't all about the carbon market and generating credits and trading them. There will be opportunities in the supply chain. We've started to see that with Coles Finest. And so if people are able to demonstrate what their net emissions position is, they will be in a good place to be able to start to access those markets as they emerge more and more. And just to finish off, we've got lots and lots of tools and resources at MLA. So if you're interested in finding out more, then I encourage you to go and visit our website and take a look. And that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. Now, just before we go on to questions, I'd just like to say that FCA thanks our 2 speakers for participating in this webinar tonight. Our role in the process is to bring this sort of information to our farmer members, of which we have 7,400 members at the moment and growing rapidly. We also try and advocate for better policies and to demystify some of the poor information that is spread about. We work with all levels of government, and I guess, you know, for farmers that are attending tonight, if you're looking for more information, you can get it from the MLA, or we do have a number of webinars on our website on previous discussions about carbon farming what the emissions reduction funds and various other things you might need to know about. So we'll now move on to the questions and answers, and we'll see how we go with that. So the first one I've got is for Sabina. Do fugitive methane emissions apply equally to brown and black coal? And the person asking this is thinking about the open cut mines at the Latrobe Valley. Will they present an ongoing problem even after restoration and closure?
So brown coal in general is much less methane intensive. So methane should definitely be less of a problem. And brown coal is also generally done in open cut mines. And when we talk about open cut mines, there will be some post-mining emissions. So from, I guess, maybe you've seen them, the like large coal heaps that are then left. And if they're not covered, they would probably still be emitting some methane. But in terms of the significance of it, it's estimated to be far less than any of the other major sources that I've covered. But I would also say that there is again a gap in the research in this, and there's been very few measurements of emissions from coal mine heaps, and it's rarely estimated emissions from coal mine heaps or reported on. So yes, it's a gap in the understanding, but from what we know, we think that brown coal and coal heaps have minimal emissions after mining.
Well, that's a blessing in disguise, I suppose. Now for Margaret, I've got a question here. Is there a difference in methane levels from grass-fed to grain-fed cattle?
Yes, so there is. So methane emissions from cattle are pretty much directly related to the digestibility of what they're eating and the quality of the feed. So in grain, it's highly digestible. It promotes higher rates of growth. So that means that animals achieve sale weights faster than if they're on grass. However, saying that, at any one time in Australia at the moment, there's about 1% of our herd is in feedlots, and animals are sort of in feedlots anywhere from 30 days if it's just a grain finished system, or 300 days and more for things like Wagyu. It is an important part of the puzzle for us in reducing our methane emissions, because by combining, it's a really good way to finish off cattle that have been raised on grass for at least some period of their life, and then get them to those sale weights faster. But it's never going to be the type of thing that all of the cattle in Australia are produced in intensive systems, because as I explained, we've got this huge area of land that's only suitable for ruminant production, and we have a industry in Australia that relies on both of those industries working really well together.
Thank you, Margaret. Another question for Sabina. We'll sort of put two questions together here. What's the percentage of CH4 under reporting in Australia coal industry, and do the mines self-report, and are the emissions measured by an independent agency, and if not, why not?
So it's very hard to put an estimate on how much the emissions are being underreported. As I mentioned, so the government reported around 1 million tonnes, and when the IEA estimated it, they put it at 1.8 million tonnes. So, we're looking at almost double what was officially reported. Again, until more studies are done and until we could tell really how much is it really being overestimated. So we couldn't give a figure on that. All I can tell you is that the estimate from the IEA, which is the only other total sort of Australia estimate for coal mine methane, has put the emissions at almost double. And can you just repeat the second question, because I think there was a few parts to it.
The second question was about are the emissions monitored by the coal companies themselves, or is it done by an independent agency? And if not, why not?
Yeah, so the coal mines report their emission estimates to, it depends, if they're emitting over, I think it's 100,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, they have to report their emissions also to the clean energy regulator. Otherwise, all of the mines have to report their emissions to the government. But as I mentioned, sometimes these reporting of emissions is just estimates, because they're not necessarily, there's no law saying that an open cut mine would have to measure their emissions. They can estimate their emissions using these default emission factors. And the same as with underground mines. Underground mines generally measure some for, like they do measure some of their methane because they have to for the safety of the mine, but it's not done, I guess, precisely enough if we're talking about measuring methane and methane emissions. It's done well enough in terms of safety, but it's not done well enough to really understand how much methane is really being emitted. So these are the things that need to be improved, but the method is verified, but the emissions aren't gone and verified independently, if that makes sense. Thank
you, Sabina. Now another question for Margaret. There seems to be a lot of questions about Asparagopsis seaweed. The question here is, does Asparagopsis or bromoform cause lesions in the rumen or result in contamination of meat, milk, or the environment? I guess they're asking about the safety of the process.
Yeah, sure. So MLA are still working on Asparagopsis with Future Feed, who are the company looking after research at the moment and also commercialization of Asparagopsis. There have been some studies that have shown some adverse effects. I think the main piece of what we're trying to do with our research is to ensure that we're looking at meat quality, animal safety, and all of those other potential adverse impacts to ensure we've got a really safe and healthy product for our animals. We are also working on another additive, Bovia, which has also been shown to have some pretty substantial potential to mitigate methane. So I guess just important to note that Asparagopsis isn't the only supplement that we're looking at, and it's probably not the silver bullet. There will be a number of additives that will come into the mix to contribute to the solution.
Okay. Just another quick question for you, Margaret. What difference does it make to the reporting if cattle numbers are static, rising or falling?
Sure. So with increased cattle numbers, obviously we are going to see increased levels of emissions. So what we are trying to do is make sure that we are improving productivity at the same time. So as I said, we're really focused on long-term prosperity of the industry and doubling the value of red meat sales. So certainly the way that our industry coming at it is not to reduce animal numbers to achieve our target. We really believe that we've got enough evidence in the research now to indicate that we can reduce methane without having to reduce cattle numbers and sheep numbers.
Very good. Now, Sabina, how do agricultural methane emissions, the emissions from animals, compare with fugitive methane emissions from the gas and coal industries? And I would imagine we're talking about quantitatively here.
Yep, so it depends, because I guess the methane emissions from fossil fuels, when we're talking about methane, it's still methane, you know, it's whether it's methane from agriculture, whether it's methane from fossil fuels, it's still methane gas, and it's still going to have a similar effect in the atmosphere. The difference comes Once the methane reacts and turns into CO2, there's CO2 produced once methane reacts in the atmosphere. For fossil fuel methane, this CO2 is additional CO2 in the atmosphere, which before was not there. So it also has additional CO2. For any biogenic methane, which means for cattle, also for waste, the CO2 that's produced once methane reacts is has just been taken from the atmosphere. So technically it's not additional carbon dioxide. But in terms of methane, it's still additional methane into the atmosphere, if we'd like to. Both are additional methane sources.
Thank you. I'm just trying to find well, the next question was sort of explained there on the natural cycle and the time frames and breaking it down. Here's a question for Sabina. What obligations do coal and gas companies have to monitor, report and stop fugitive emissions? And can companies be prosecuted for fugitive emissions? And if so, by whom?
So they must report on their emissions, methane emissions, in accordance with Australia's monitoring framework. So this they have to do. Then again, as I mentioned, the problems with currently how you monitor and all of that. There's currently nothing in place to say that they would have to capture them or reduce their methane emissions. So, and I think this is also why we've seen that, for example, the coal mining industry is emitting methane, is because there's really no incentive for them not to, because if there was, a large portion of it could be reduced, and sometimes even to the benefit of the mine. So, you know, sometimes they can use it for electricity or in the process of their coal processes. So yeah, that's something that I guess it will be something that the government has to implement, and that's something that the Europe in the EU, it's currently going through Parliament, is a proposed EU methane regulation, which is trying to regulate the methane emitted by the oil and gas industry and also by the coal mining industry, which would then mean that they can or cannot emit certain methane or certain amounts of methane or above certain amounts of methane. So this is how Europe is going about trying to regulate the methane coming from the fossil fuel industry.
All right, Margaret, another question for you. How would producers measure enteric methane, as there is a wide range quoted from 50 to 90 kilograms per head of methane?
Great question. There's actually some calculators that have been developed for livestock producers to calculate their net emissions. It requires details about what classes of livestock people are growing, what their live weight gains are, what the quality is of the feed that they're eating. And it also includes calculation of what their energy usage is on farm, and so their emissions that are coming from that as well. There's MLA are actually in the process of developing a digital calculator that will be housed in our My MLA site, and a lot of the learning resources that we're developing at the moment are to provide instruction to producers to be able to do that calculation. So that calculator will be available for people to go and start using hopefully in mid-February of next year.
Okay, and final question of the night to Sabina. Do you know if there has been any acknowledgement by either Hale Creek Mining Company or Australian regulators of the increase in methane emissions? That is, has the research been accepted as providing a truer methane emissions measure?
So Hale Creek Mine is run by Glencore Company, and they released a public statement and saying that they did not accept the research because of satellite. They don't accept satellite data. So that was their response. I guess, if you like my opinion, satellite data it's not if a satellite measures a mine, it's 100% measured the correct amount of emissions. This is for sure not the case. To get an understanding of a mine's emissions, it needs to be a combination of measuring at the mine and then verifying through satellites. So the satellite will be able to pick up if there's a big discrepancy between what's being reported and what's being then measured from the satellite. So this is really where satellite data is going to come in very useful in terms of verification of the methane emissions, but not being able to pinpoint the exact amount the coal mine is measuring. Yes, but Glencore did not accept the research. But I do actually think that Australian government and also the EU government has started to test and use satellite data to verify future methane emissions reporting. So it is something that's coming. There's new satellites on the way. So it's definitely something that's coming soon.
Thank you, Sabina. And with that, we'll call it a night. Thank you, Margaret and Sabina, for being such patient question answerers. I think people have learned a lot. Now, where people can get information, I would suggest if they want more information, they go to the MLA website. They could look up our past webinars, or else they could write to us and see if we can answer the questions for you at FCA. So that's about how I would suggest you do go about that. We have another webinar coming up next month on being presented by John Deere, and it's about the future development of tractor technology, I guess, EV tractors or heavy machinery, or whether it's some other form of development. So for those interested in that sort of agriculture, turn up next month. So without further ado, I'll thank everybody for attending. Thank you to all the participants that turned up and asked such brilliant questions. Sorry we couldn't get to them all. Thank you to Sabina, and thank you to Margaret. Thank you to Claire for helping in the background. Thank you very much to everybody else. Bye.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks, Margaret, Sabina, and Pete. I'm going to close it all now. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.